All right, let's talk about one of psychology's most famous studies. It's cited in basically every textbook, but it's also one of the most controversial and honestly ethically messed up experiments ever done. Today, we are diving deep into the story of little Albert.
So think about this for a second. Are you born with your fears or do you learn them? It's a huge question, right? Well, back in 1920, two psychologists, John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner, decided to find out. Their plan? Pretty bold. They wanted to see if they could take a totally happy, fearless baby and actually teach him to be scared of something completely harmless.
Okay, so to pull this off, their setup was actually pretty simple. They just needed two key ingredients, a baby and a way to scare him.
And they found their subject in a 9-month-old baby they called Little Albert. Now, what's really interesting is why they chose him. He wasn't just any baby. He was known for being incredibly calm and stable. They actually described him as stolid and unemotional. So for them, he was the perfect blank slate. A canvas where they believed they could paint a brand new fear.
So, before they started the real experiment, they had to figure out what, if anything, already scared him. They did what they called baseline tests. They brought out a whole bunch of stuff. A live white rat, a bunny, a dog, you name it. And little Albert? He wasn't scared at all. In fact, he was curious. He was reaching out, trying to touch them. But then they found something that worked. A loud, sudden, jarring noise. They took a steel bar and smacked it with a hammer right behind his head. Yeah, that made him cry.
Okay, so now they have their two key pieces, right? They know the rat causes no fear, but the loud noise causes a lot of fear. The stage was set. Their goal was simple in a way. Could they take the fear from the noise and attach it to the rat?
And what they were doing here is literally the textbook definition of classical conditioning. Let's just walk through how it works. So, step 1, you have the white rat. It's a neutral stimulus. Albert's not scared of it. Step 2, you have the loud noise. That's what's called an unconditioned stimulus because it naturally causes a fear response. Nobody has to learn to be scared of a sudden loud bang. Now here comes the really crucial part. Step 3, the pairing. They started putting the two together. Every single time little Albert would reach for that friendly rat, bam, they'd strike the steel bar. And after doing this over and over, something changed. The rat, which used to be totally neutral, became a conditioned stimulus. Just seeing the rat was now enough to produce the conditioned response, fear. No noise needed.
And this whole process didn't even take that long. It happened over just a handful of sessions when Albert was about 11 months old. And get this, after only 7 times pairing the rat with that awful noise, the researchers were like, yep, we did it. They concluded they had successfully manufactured a brand new fear.
But they weren't done yet. Not even close. Watson and Rayner had another question. Okay, so he's afraid of the white rat. But would that fear spread? Would Albert now be scared of other similar things?
And, well, according to their official report, the answer was a big yes. They said Albert started showing fear not just to the rat, but to a rabbit, a dog, a sealskin fur coat, even a Santa Claus mask with that big, white, fluffy beard. It's this classic idea in psychology called stimulus generalization. And to really sell how powerful this effect was, they wrote this incredibly vivid line in their paper. They said Albert would try to crawl away so fast that they could barely catch him before he fell off the edge of the table. I mean, an image like that, it's no wonder this story got locked into psychology textbooks for the next 100 years.
Okay, so that's the story we've all been told. But it's not the whole story, not by a long shot. Because when researchers in recent years went back and looked at Watson's original notes, and more importantly, the actual film they shot of the experiment, some pretty big cracks started to show up in this perfect little narrative.
So the legend says Albert developed this intense, clear-cut phobia. But what you actually see on film, it's a lot messier. His reactions are kind of weak, really inconsistent. At some points, he's even still trying to touch the rat. And here's the real kicker. Whenever he sucked his thumb, it was like a magic off switch for the fear. It seemed to calm him down so much that Watson literally had to pull the poor kid's thumb out of his mouth to even get a fear reaction on camera.
I mean, if you look at this study with modern scientific eyes, it's just a mess. First off, it's just one baby. You can't generalize from a single subject. There was no control group, so we have nothing to compare him to. Maybe he was just getting more fearful as he got older. That happens with kids. And their data? It was just their own subjective notes, not any kind of objective measurement. The whole thing is just scientifically shaky from top to bottom.
But look, as bad as the science was, it's almost nothing compared to the ethical problems. And honestly, this is where the story gets really dark. Now, we do have to remember this was 1920. It was a long, long time before we had the strict ethical rules for research that we have today. But even for its time, what they did was pretty shocking.
Let's just start with the most obvious one. Their entire goal was to deliberately cause psychological harm to a baby. They intentionally set out to create fear and distress in an infant. Just think about that.
Then you have the problem of informed consent. Sure, Albert's mother agreed to let him be in a study, but there's no way she was fully informed. She probably had no idea their plan was to systematically terrify her child.
And this might be the worst part of the whole thing. They never fixed it. They never deconditioned him. Apparently, Albert's mom pulled him out of the hospital before they got around to it. And Watson and Rayner, they made zero effort to follow up. They just left this little boy, potentially, with a whole new set of fears that they themselves had created.
So where does that leave us with the little Albert experiment? For decades, it was held up as this foundational, classic study. But today, well, it's viewed a lot more like a cautionary tale. And that's really its complicated legacy, isn't it? It gives us this really simple, easy-to-remember story about how classical conditioning works. The problem is, that story isn't even really accurate. The scientific findings were pretty weak, and the methods, well, they were just completely indefensible.
In fact, if you look at modern analyses of that old film footage, some experts argue that Albert's reactions weren't that extreme at all. They might have just been normal baby fussiness, which has led some historians to a really interesting conclusion. Maybe the film wasn't about proving a scientific fact. Maybe it was more of a promotional device, a clever bit of marketing for Watson to get more attention and funding for his new ideas about behaviorism.
And all of this really leaves us with one kind of unsettling final thought. The story of little Albert proves that a really flawed, maybe even fabricated, experiment can become a scientific legend. And it just makes you wonder, right? How many other famous studies, the ones we all learn about in school, have their own hidden stories, just waiting to be uncovered?